Well, it's that time of the podcast again where we discuss real talk with the Pimpcron, where I handpick, I pluck from the grove of ideas a topic that I think you guys should listen to. And I was talking to a friend the other day, and the idea of narrative games and how to design them and all that came up recently. And it's funny because I've had a lot of people in the past ask me about narrative games. You may know that I do a bunch of giant narratives at Shorehammer and things like that. So I've done the Pimpcron's Epic War Planner that's on Amazon with all the different variations and narrative stuff for Warhammer and all that. So um, I've got quite a bit of experience with narrative gaming and narrative game design. So I figured I would run you through all the paces of exactly what you should be looking out for and ideas and pitfalls and things like that of narrative gaming because it is not for everybody. It truly isn't. So let's start with the players. You have to have two players that have the same mindset because that's going to affect the mission, it's going to affect the rules, it's going to affect the list building, everything. So you need two people that are willing to set aside their competitive differences. One may be more tournament oriented, one may be more narrative or whatever. And they both have to agree okay, listen, the goal of this game is not for me to win or for you to win per se. You're still going to make the best choices you can and all of that. But the real goal is to have a really cool game. And the closer it is, then the more fun both of us are going to have. Nobody ever gets upset over losing by 1 point or 2 points or 3 points. Nobody ever gets upset by that because you go, oh man, I lost, but it was a close game. Another thing to think about in narrative gaming is that it's not me as a player versus you as a player. It's actually, we're playing a narrative. So we're looking down as gods on the battlefield, and it's this force on the board that happens to be controlled by me versus your force that happens to be controlled by you. But you have to look at them as real people, and you realize that war is never fair. Never, ever. Matter of fact, most of the time, reading about history and things like that, probably 70% of the battles turned out exactly the way that if you were literally a god looking down on the battlefield, you'd go, oh, yeah, side B is probably going to win. Just by looking at their resources, their morale, their number of people, their position, all of that stuff, their leadership. In real life, war is very unfair and is basically a gotcha. Whoever can catch the other person in a bad situation. But this is not making for very good narrative play because you guys want a fair game as best as you can make it and you want it to be fairly balanced. So, what you do is you get two like-minded individuals that are willing to sacrifice everything for the narrative so that it is cool, so that in a clutch moment you might let the guy re-roll something or whatever just because it would be so cool if this happened or that happened, okay? That starts with the mindset. Then it comes to the list. Now, there's several different ways you can do lists, but a lot of times you might want to start making your list based off the mission. And that way, you know that, and you're thinking about yourself, oh, well, I'm going to cheese it. I'm going to cheese it. Oh, if my army's got to move across the board, then I'm going to take all cavalry or jet bikes or what. No, no, no. That's actually the opposite of what you want to do. Realistically, make a list that you think would actually enter this situation. Okay. So, for instance, just as a for instance, a couple months ago, I played a narrative game, a purely narrative game, where this castle that I had was a brewery, and all of my forces around it were basically the local townspeople and everything. And my friend David had these gargants and I think it was his Sons of Bahamut or whatever, but they were trying to get to the brewery because the Gargans think that they weren't paid well enough for their last battle or whatever with the orcs. So they came to raid our brewery, and all of our citizens were like, no, you're not raiding our brewery. This is the only source of income for our town. So that's basically the basis for it. So in this case, he's got to get across the board and do a monstrous action into my brewery to destroy it and start drinking the alcohol, and then I instantly fail. In this particular mission, it didn't really behoove either one of us to be super fast or super anything, like take a lot of magic or have anything like that. So we basically were able to take two normal lists. And of course, at the beginning of the game, you should look over your opponent's list and see, let's say he's taking 17 Lehman Russes and all you've got is Grots. You're going to be like, hey, this is not going to be a fair game. It's not going to be, remember the goal and remind your opponent, remember the goal is that we have a very close game. Not that one of us gets steamrolled, because that's never fun, even in a narrative or a competitive game. So then they could change their list or whatever. Now, if you want this codified a little more, because a lot of this, I talk about the mindset of the players, they have to have a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of foresight, a little bit of experience wargaming. It may not work out so well with brand new players because they don't know necessarily. They might go, oh, well, I took all Grots and he took all Lehman Russes. Oh, well, that's still fair. It's the same number of points. Well, not entirely, because Grots have low morale. A lot of people will be running. They've got no save, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just not going to be a very even matchup. So that is one of the first things to do, is make sure that both of the lists are pretty well balanced and nothing is like super abusive or something like that. One of the things we've decided is that it's always fun to make basically an extra 500-point list. So I've discussed this on the podcast before, but maybe you haven't heard it. Is that let's say we're going to play a 1,500-point game, right? Well, each one of us actually makes 4 500-point lists. So it's a 2,000-point list total, but each one of them is an individual list. And we're ignoring the Force Org. So we're ignoring detachments, all of that. So then you present your 4 lists to your opponent, and he picks one of the lists he doesn't want to play against. So that is a really interesting dynamic, because you don't want to put your Death Star in one unit, in one list, because if I see the Death Star, I'm just going to be like, oh yeah, I don't want to play against the Death Star, so I'm cutting that out. And you do the same thing for me. So what it ends up doing is it forces people to passively make a much more well-rounded list, and it's not so heavy or whatever, or lopsided. And they know that whatever they put in there, you can potentially cut out. So as far as synergies and planning and stuff, it's really hard to plan for that, which actually makes it really good, because the fewer synergies you have in these narrative lists, the less OP, the less abusive that it gets. So it's actually a really good idea. When thinking about a mission, you typically want to pick something, a scenario or whatever that you want to do, that will facilitate a narrative, like such as my brewery being destroyed. And then you go, oh, okay, well, ale guzzler gargants get paid in alcohol, right, by the people that hire them. And why don't we make this castle a brewery? And then they're trying to attack the brewery. That's awesome. Okay. Are we going to give the castle like stats? You certainly could. Give it the stats of a Land Raider if you're playing 40K, or give it the stats of, I don't know, a Mall Crusher or something if you're playing Age of Sigmar. But what we decided instead is, because it's a building and he's got an army essentially full of monsters that can all do monstrous actions, why don't we just do the already existing for Age of Sigmar monstrous action of destroying a piece of scenery? So we're like, okay, that's awesome. So essentially, I am trying to bubble wrap this brewery and keep him from getting into base contact with it. And he's trying to chew through my people and then take a monstrous action and destroy it. So that worked out really well. Now, as far as deployment goes, you want to make sure that typically it's a good idea to stay 24 inches away from each other. And you'll notice that almost all of Games Workshop's mission deployments are 24 inches from deployment zones. That's usually a good idea. I would never do closer than 18 inches, because occasionally, like let's say your mission is you're deploying in the very center and your opponent has to deploy 24 inches away from you. A lot of times that ends up just being the two long sides, because if you're doing 24 inches, well, then there's no way that they can properly encircle you. And properly encircling someone is one of the neat things about deploying in the center, and then someone can deploy all the way around you. It does give you some anxiety. It does give you a siege effect. You're like, oh God, I'm surrounded on all sides. There's nowhere to run. And it does actually have a psychological effect on the player. So it's quite fun. So as far as the mission goes, you often want to pick one primary mission, and you're like, okay, this is what we're doing, like destroying the brewery. But it's also really good to have a secondary uh, objective that let's say the defender of the brewery chooses when they all are also trying to win. Essentially, like, okay, we can stop these Gargants if we kill the Mega Gargant. If we can kill him, then the rest of them are going to go, oh God, and they're going to run away. So that's what we ended up doing. The Mega Gargant was the leader, and we threw everything into him. He kept doing heroic actions, so he was healing, and it was quite fun. We whittled him down to just, it was under 10 hit points. We whittled him down pretty well. Meanwhile, my lines are being bombarded by gargants, which was quite crazy and fun and a bit anxious too. In the end, what ended up happening is that my left side ended up collapsing, failed morale, ran away, all of that. And then he was able to finally do his monstrous action where he broke through my defenses, and they ended up destroying the brewery. So you very well could make a campaign out of that. Okay, they destroyed our brewery. You know what? Next mission, we're gonna get revenge on you guys. We're gonna go raid your stockpile of ale or whatever for the gargants, and then we could reverse it and do something different the next time we meet. And so you see that is feeding into the narrative of it. We have a reason for fighting back now. You had a reason for attacking us. We have a reason for fighting back. And that's the way it goes. It's quite fun. Another thing is that the less control you can take from your players, because players are naturally going to play a bit competitive, obviously. They're trying to win, although you should be curbing that in a narrative game truly, but they are truly trying to win. So they should be making the best decisions, etc. So a lot of times, like such as taking it, cutting out 500 points of the list, things like that, that takes a little bit of control away from the player, and it tones down on the cheese and the synergies. Another thing that really cuts down on that is randomizing the deployment. So if you want to break up your deployment zone up into 6 zones, and I have a way of doing that, I've discussed it on the podcast before, but break it up into 6 zones. If you either don't have a mission yet, a lot of times that will help inform what type of mission you're going to do by what random deployment zones all your units go in. But even if you do have a mission in mind, it's pretty cool to have 6 different zones, and every time you go to deploy a unit, you roll for what zone they have to be deployed in, a 12 by 12-inch square. And that gets really cool because that takes the deployment out of your, which keep in mind, in reality, a lot of the deployments and the tactics of real world generals in the past have been out of their hands. They either got caught with their pants down when they're at camp or whatever, or they caught the other people in a compromising position, trying to cross a river or whatever. So this actually helps inform sometimes the mission you play if you don't have an idea yet, or it also cuts down on synergies, which is good for narrative. And thirdly, randomizing the deployment keeps you from, uh, if you do have the synergies in your list, it helps break up your synergies. And occasionally, it puts you in a weird circumstance because, like, let's say you take a couple wizards, right? And the wizards accidentally, you rolled for the deployment, they deploy right up to the center of the board or something like that. And you're like, oh God, that is rough, the way we do it, if you can think about your half of the board, right? In Age of Sigmar or 40K, we make 6 12-inch squares. One is all the way to the left, all the way up, touching. It's your half of the board, but it's touching the center line. Then go to the right, and there's a square center right, touching the center line right in the middle. And then there's one on the right touching the center line. Then touching that right deployment zone along that edge is one that touches your backboard, a 12-inch one. And then there's another one right in the middle touching your backboard, and there's one on the left touching your backboard. So it ends up you really do get spread out, and it really makes the game interesting. It really does. It might sound like, "Oh, I don't want to do that," but really it's really cool. So, like I said, you might have some wizards that get deployed directly on the middle line of the board. And keep in mind that with this random deployment, sometimes you can have enemies that deploy right next to your units. Now, I know I said the 24-inch separation and all that, but the 24-inch separation is when you have control over where you deploy what. But when you do the randomized deployment, it actually works pretty well because it is like getting caught with your pants down. It really does work out well. So these are a bunch of the ideas that we've come up with. One of these days, I'll probably make a book based on all the narrative stuff I've learned. But keep in mind, you got to have the right state of mind. Make sure you got a player that can actually tone it down and do this. Randomizing lists or taking things out is probably a good idea if you think there might be any chance, or it actually just simplifies things too. If you don't want to do that, then you guys got to talk it out. I'm taking this, you're taking that. Do you think these are going to be even chances of winning? Okay. Then you want to decide what your mission is. Keep in mind 24 inches deployment separation if you don't have if you do have control over deployment. Keep in mind it's also really fun to randomize deployment. in which case 24 inches separation is not necessary because you very well could have a great or terrible matchup. It's just random, just like real life is oftentimes on the battlefield. And then you also want to have a primary objective, which makes things nice and simple, but it's also good to have a secondary objective so that the defender can also do something to stop the attack. Um, and that's, or you can think of even doing reserves. You can have things in reserve like extra points or whatever. Another good idea that I actually didn't touch on is that sometimes we'll make like uh, an extra 500 point list or something like that, or sometimes completely destroyed units can come back on the board occasionally, and that's if both people are feeling like, oh, this is kind of swinging in one person's favor. Then we'll both agree to, okay, you can bring on another unit, because we want that to be very, very close so that nobody's completely wiped off the board and nobody's completely crushing it. You want to balance that. So hopefully this is interesting and informative to all of you. Narratives are really one of my favorite things. I've gotten better. I've ran 7 narratives at Shorehammer now. Well, actually, no, because now we have 3 narratives each Shorehammer. So I've ran like 20 narratives with 24 people in it, having no idea what they're bringing in their lists, and they usually work out well. The couple times that they didn't work out so well is one year I did make the mistake of not knowing that one of the armies had a stratagem to run in the shooting phase. Yeah. So they were able to get the objective and then run away, and it was perfectly legal, but that did skew things quite a bit. Once again, war's never fair, but you kind of want your game to be as fair as possible. So that was a design issue on my part because I didn't know of that stratagem, and now I will definitely keep an eye out for that sort of thing from now on. That was a couple years ago. But usually what it is that players do bad matchup on their own. They will, they have to move across the board to do this, and then they put the player on there that's got 4 or 5 inch movement with their troops. And I'm like, why would you do that? Why would you not put cavalry or jet bikes or whatever there? So sometimes that does end up happening. So this year, actually, at Shorehammer, we're going to meet a half hour earlier and give people plenty of time. I'm actually going to put notes from the designer, which of course is me. Notes from the designer on each table going, listen, if you're on this side, you should put fast armies on this side. You have to cross the board. And then go over here and go, look, on this board, you're going to want a lot of shooting because of whatever. And I'm help guide them, and maybe they'll make better decisions. Because a few times we've had some bad matchups, it's because I let the teams just choose where they deploy their players, and they made bad choices. And then they're like, oh, this isn't fair. I'm like, well, yeah, you got 5 inch movement. You're supposed to move 24 inches across the board. Like, yeah, that's not, it's a bad choice. But this year, every year I get a little better. And this year I'm going to be holding their hand even more to try to make sure the games are balanced. Now, one thing, if you're doing it in a big group like Shorehammer, 24 people, right? 12 versus 12. Um, One thing that I do, and this might be a good idea if you decide to run some big event, if it's more than 2 players, is I go around at the end of each round and I tell everybody, I call it taking the temperature. I go around each board and I go, all right, I'm taking the temperature. How you guys feeling about it? I ask the one side, I ask the other side. And if they both go, well, it's pretty much up in the air, I go, okay, cool. I'm not going to mess with anything. And then I go to the next battle area. And I go, okay, what about you guys? Temperature. And if one army's like, oh, we're getting our ass handed to us, and the other one's like, yeah, it's really in our favor, I go, okay, cool. And then they can bring back destroyed units to help bolster, and once again, you want it to be very, very close. So if one person's getting steamrolled, getting some extra units in there helps breathe more life and firepower and all that into their army. And that is how, starting this year, I've been able to really make the armies more balanced. And it's worked out really well. Anyway, thank you to GameMatt.eu for supporting the show, and panhandle3d.etsy.com. And of course, my beautiful, sexy, good smelling Patreon patrons. I will see you all next week.